For thousands of years, humans have looked at bees and believed they understood them. Tiny insects, yellow and black bodies, buzzing from flower to flower, making honey. That was the story. Or at least, that's the story we told ourselves. Because if you remove honey from the equation, a far stranger question begins to emerge. Why would evolution invest millions of years creating one of the most sophisticated biological systems on Earth, just to produce something humans spread on toast? It doesn't make sense. Not even close. In fact, the deeper scientists looked into bees, the more unsettling the truth became. Because honey is not the most important thing bees produce. Not even remotely. Every second of every day, billions of bees are carrying out a planetary scale operation so vast, so ancient, and so essential that modern civilization would struggle to survive without it. Fields of crops, forests, wild ecosystems, entire food chains. All of them are connected to a hidden network that most people never notice. And at the center of that network is a creature weighing less than a paperclip. But the mystery goes even deeper. Inside every hive lives a society that behaves less like a colony and more like a single living organism. Thousands of individuals, one collective intelligence. No leader giving orders, no central government, no master blueprint. Yet somehow, the system works with astonishing precision. Bees can communicate locations without words. They can make group decisions. They can regulate temperature with incredible accuracy. And together, they accomplish tasks that no individual bee could ever understand. So here's the question. If honey isn't the real story, then what is? Why do flowers depend on them? Why do entire ecosystems depend on them? And why are scientists warning that the disappearance of bees could trigger consequences far beyond anything most people imagine? Tonight, we're going beyond the honey, beyond the hive, and beyond one of nature's greatest misunderstandings. Because by the end of this documentary, you may discover that bees were never making honey for us, and that their true function on Earth is far more important than anyone ever realized. For most people, the story of bees begins and ends with honey. Ask someone why bees exist, and the answer is usually immediate. They make honey. It's a belief so common that few people ever stop to question it. After all, honey has fascinated humans for thousands of years. Ancient cave paintings discovered in Spain suggest humans were collecting honey more than 8,000 years ago. The ancient Egyptians valued it so highly that it was used as food, medicine, and even placed inside tombs. The Greeks praised it. The Romans traded it. And long before sugar became common, honey was one of humanity's most valuable natural sweeteners. For much of human history, honey was our relationship with bees. It was the product we could see, the reward we could harvest, the reason we paid attention to them at all. But there's a problem with this story, a very big problem. Nature doesn't care about human preferences. Evolution doesn't design species around human desires, and evolution certainly didn't spend tens of millions of years perfecting bees, just so one day humans could enjoy honey in their tea. That isn't how nature works. To understand why bees exist, we have to stop looking at them through human eyes. Instead, we have to ask a different question. What purpose does honey serve for the bees themselves? Because contrary to popular belief, honey was never created for us. It is not a gift. It is not a product. And it is certainly not the primary objective of a bee colony. Honey is survival fuel, nothing more. Every drop of honey inside a hive represents stored energy, a reserve of calories carefully collected during times of abundance, so the colony can survive periods of scarcity. Worker bees spend countless hours gathering nectar from flowers. Back inside the hive, that nectar is processed, transformed, and stored. Over time, water content is reduced. Sugars become concentrated. And the result is a remarkably stable food source capable of lasting for months. In other words, honey is a survival battery, a biological energy reserve, the equivalent of stocking a warehouse before winter arrives. And when viewed this way, the entire human-centered narrative begins to fall apart. Because honey isn't the goal. It's simply a tool, a survival strategy, a means to an end. But that realization raises an even more important question. If honey isn't the primary purpose, Then where did bees come from? And why did they evolve in the first place? To answer that question, we have to travel back more than 100 million years, back to a world that looked very different from the one we know today. Dinosaurs still ruled the earth. Massive reptiles dominated forests and plains. Flowering plants were beginning to spread across the planet. And within this changing environment, a remarkable evolutionary partnership was quietly taking shape. The earliest ancestors of modern bees were not honeymakers. In fact, they were likely descendants of predatory wasp-like insects, creatures that hunted other insects to feed their young. But over countless generations, something extraordinary happened. Certain species began collecting pollen instead of prey. Pollen provided an abundant food source. Flowers benefited because their reproductive material was carried from plant to plant, and a powerful evolutionary alliance was born. Both sides gained advantages. Plants reproduced more efficiently. The insects gained reliable nutrition. Over millions of years, this relationship became increasingly sophisticated. Flowers evolved colors, patterns, scents, shapes, all designed to attract pollinators. Meanwhile, bees evolved specialized body structures perfectly suited for gathering and transporting pollen, tiny branched hairs, advanced sensory systems, exceptional navigation abilities. Everything about their biology began adapting toward a single mission, not honey production, pollination. And this distinction changes everything, because the moment you understand that bees evolved alongside flowers, you realize something important. Honey is not the center of the story. Pollination is. Honey is merely the fuel that allows the system to keep running, like gasoline inside an engine. Useful, necessary, but not the reason the engine exists. The deeper scientists studied bee evolution, the clearer this became. Entire ecosystems were being shaped by interactions between flowering plants and pollinators. Forests, grasslands, meadows, fruit-bearing species, wildflowers. Countless forms of life became connected through this invisible biological network, a network that had been operating for tens of millions of years before the first human ever appeared. And yet, most people still associate bees with jars of honey sitting on supermarket shelves. The visible product overshadowed the invisible system. We focused on what bees gave us and ignored what they were actually doing. But as we're about to discover, that hidden activity may be one of the most important processes happening anywhere on Earth, because without it, entire ecosystems begin to collapse. And the world we depend upon starts looking very different indeed. To understand why, we need to follow the bees beyond the hive and into the vast planetary network they've been maintaining for millions of years. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that the world's transportation systems had vanished overnight. No trucks, no cargo ships, no trains, no aircraft, no roads carrying goods from one place to another. Within days, supply chains would begin to break, stores would empty, industries would stall, entire economies would start collapsing. Modern civilization survives because things are constantly being moved. Resources, materials, food, information, energy. Everything depends on transportation. Now consider this. Long before humans built roads, long before the invention of engines, long before civilization itself existed, nature had already created its own transportation network, a system so vast, so efficient, and so deeply integrated into life on Earth that most people never notice it. And bees are among its most important operators. Because every time a bee lands on a flower, something remarkable happens. Without realizing it, the bee becomes a courier, a transporter, a delivery vehicle carrying one of the most valuable substances in nature, pollen. To humans, pollen may seem insignificant, a fine yellow dust, sometimes an allergy trigger, something easily ignored. But to plants, pollen represents reproduction itself. It carries the genetic material required to create the next generation. Without successful pollen transfer, many plants simply cannot reproduce. No seeds, no fruits, no new plants. The cycle ends. And this is where bees enter the story. As a bee searches for nectar, tiny grains of pollen attach themselves to the hairs covering its body. Thousands of particles can accumulate during a single visit. Then the bee leaves, flying to another flower, sometimes nearby, sometimes hundreds of meters away. And when it lands again, some of that pollen is transferred. A delivery is completed. Genetic information moves from one plant to another. Reproduction becomes possible. Life continues. To the casual observer, it looks ordinary. A bee visiting flowers. Nothing more. But zoom out far enough, and a hidden network begins to appear. Millions of bees, billions of flowers, trillions of pollen grains, all moving through ecosystems every single day. A biological logistics system operating on a planetary scale. And unlike human transportation systems, this one has been functioning for more than 100 million years. The numbers involved are almost impossible to comprehend. Scientists estimate that roughly 75% of the world's flowering plants depend on animal pollinators. Among those pollinators, bees are some of the most effective. Their bodies evolved specifically for the task. Their behavior became optimized for efficiency. Everything about them supports pollen movement, and the consequences reach far beyond wildflowers. Because humans are deeply connected to this network, whether we realize it or not. Walk through a supermarket. Look carefully at the produce section. Apples, almonds, blueberries, cherries, pumpkins, watermelons, cucumbers. Many of the foods people consume every day depend directly or indirectly on pollination, not because bees produce food themselves, but because they make plant reproduction possible. This distinction is critical. Bees are not farmers. They are facilitators. They maintain the biological infrastructure that allows countless plant species to exist. And when enough pollination occurs, entire ecosystems flourish. Forests regenerate. Grasslands expand. Fruit-bearing plants reproduce. Wildlife populations gain access to food sources. The effects ripple outward in every direction. Birds benefit. Mammals benefit. Insects benefit, humans benefit, even predators benefit indirectly. Because every layer of the ecosystem depends on layers beneath it, and bees help support those foundations. Yet the relationship goes even deeper. Over millions of years, flowers and bees entered one of the most extraordinary evolutionary partnerships ever observed. Flowers began adapting specifically to attract pollinators. Bright colors emerged. Ultraviolet patterns developed. Specialized shapes appeared. Unique fragrances evolved. Many flowers essentially became biological advertisements, signals designed to guide pollinators toward nectar. At the same time, bees evolved increasingly sophisticated abilities to locate those resources. Their vision improved. Their navigation systems advanced. Their pollen collection mechanisms became more efficient. Each side influenced the evolution of the other, a process scientists call coevolution. Neither species was acting alone. They were evolving together, shaping one another across millions of years. The result was a partnership so successful that it helped transform landscapes across the planet. And yet, despite its importance, most of this activity remains invisible. People notice honey. They notice hives. They notice the occasional bee buzzing past a flower. But they rarely see the enormous system operating underneath, the daily movement of genetic information, the maintenance of plant populations, the reproductive engine powering ecosystems, the logistics network supporting life itself. And here's the truly astonishing part. The bees don't understand any of this. No bee knows it's helping maintain ecosystems. No bee understands agriculture. No bee comprehends food chains. Each individual follows simple biological instructions. Find flowers. Collect nectar. Gather pollen. Return to the hive. That's all. Yet when billions of individuals perform these simple tasks simultaneously, an extraordinary outcome emerges. Entire ecosystems continue functioning. Forests continue growing. Plant diversity continues expanding. Life continues reproducing. A hidden system appears, not because anyone designed it, but because evolution spent millions of years refining it. And that realization forces us to confront a surprising truth. The greatest achievement of bees isn't honey. It isn't wax. It isn't even the hive itself. Their greatest achievement is maintaining one of the largest biological transportation networks ever created. A system so effective that much of life on Earth now depends upon it. But the deeper we look into bee colonies, the stranger the story becomes. because maintaining such an enormous network requires something extraordinary. A level of coordination that seems impossible for insects with tiny brains. And yet somehow, bee colonies achieve it every single day. To understand how, we have to enter the hive itself. Because inside those walls, a completely different mystery is waiting. If you were to stand beside a healthy beehive on a warm summer afternoon, you would hear thousands of wings vibrating at once. A constant hum. A sound so familiar that most people barely notice it. But hidden within that hum is one of the most extraordinary societies ever created by evolution. A society so complex that many scientists no longer describe a bee colony as a collection of individual insects. Instead, they describe it as something else, a superorganism. A living system in which thousands of separate individuals function together as if they were a single creature. At first, that idea sounds impossible. After all, every bee has its own body, its own brain, its own life. So how could an entire colony behave like one organism? The answer begins with a surprising fact. The hive does not operate the way most people imagine. In popular culture, the queen bee is often portrayed as a ruler, a monarch issuing commands, the leader of the colony, the insect equivalent of a king or emperor. But the reality is very different. The queen does not control the hive. She does not direct workers. She does not organize defenses. She does not tell bees where to fly. In fact, the queen spends most of her life performing one primary task: laying eggs, thousands of them, day after day. Her importance comes from reproduction, not leadership. The hive does not revolve around a ruler. It revolves around a system. And that system is maintained primarily by worker bees. Worker bees are all female. They make up the overwhelming majority of the colony. Every task necessary for survival is performed by them. They clean cells, feed larvae, build honeycomb, defend entrances, regulate temperature, collect nectar, gather pollen, care for the queen, store food, repair damage, and perform countless other jobs throughout their lives. What's remarkable is that no central authority assigns these tasks. There is no manager, no supervisor, no headquarters, no master plan hanging inside the hive. Yet somehow, the work gets done. Scientists studying bee colonies discovered that complex hive behavior emerges through countless local interactions. Each bee responds to information in its immediate environment. Simple rules guide individual actions. But when thousands of individuals follow those rules simultaneously, a highly organized system emerges. This phenomenon is known as emergence, and it appears throughout nature. Individual neurons create consciousness. Individual ants create colonies. Individual birds create flocks. And individual bees create something astonishingly close to a living superorganism. But perhaps the most famous example of bee intelligence comes from communication, because bees possess a method of sharing information that puzzled scientists for decades. Imagine discovering a rich field of flowers several kilometers away from your home. How would you explain its location to thousands of others without using language, without maps, without written instructions? For bees, the answer is movement. Inside the darkness of the hive, returning foragers perform a behavior known as the waggle dance. The dance looks strange to human eyes. A series of vibrations, turns, loops, repeated patterns. But hidden within those movements is information, direction, distance, quality of the food source. Other bees observe carefully. They decode the signals and then fly directly toward locations they have never visited before. It is one of the most sophisticated communication systems ever discovered in an insect. A living navigation language built entirely from movement. And communication is only the beginning, because bee colonies also make decisions. Collectively. Consider what happens when a colony becomes too large. Eventually, a swarm may leave to establish a new home. Thousands of bees must agree on a suitable location. But who chooses? The queen? No. A leader? No. Instead, scout bees search independently. Each scout evaluates potential nesting sites. When a promising location is found, the scout returns and advertises it through dancing. Other scouts investigate. If they agree, support grows. If they disagree, competing sites receive attention. Gradually, through repeated information sharing, a consensus emerges. The colony reaches a decision. not through dictatorship, but through something surprisingly similar to democratic voting. Researchers studying swarm behavior have compared this process to collective intelligence systems used by human societies. No individual bee understands the entire problem, yet together, the colony often selects remarkably effective solutions. And then there is temperature control, a challenge that becomes especially important because developing bee larvae require extremely stable conditions. The brood area inside a hive must remain close to a narrow temperature range. Too cold, development suffers. Too hot, the colony faces danger. Yet bees have no air conditioners, no heaters, no technology. Instead, thousands of workers cooperate to regulate hive conditions. When temperatures rise, workers fan their wings. Air circulation increases. Water may be collected and distributed for evaporative cooling. When temperatures fall, bees cluster together, generating heat through muscular activity. The result is astonishing precision, a living climate control system created entirely through collective behavior. Again, no individual bee manages the process. The colony itself responds, just as a body regulates its own temperature. And this is why many scientists use the term superorganism, because when viewed from a distance, the hive begins to resemble a single living entity. Worker bees function like cells. Communication pathways act like nerves. Food storage resembles metabolism. Defense systems resemble immune responses. Temperature regulation resembles homeostasis. Reproduction occurs through the queen. Every major function associated with a living organism appears at the colony level. The individual bee matters. But the colony matters more. And evolution seems to have optimized the hive as a whole, not the individual members within it, which leads to an unsettling realization. When we observe a bee, we may not actually be looking at the complete organism. We may only be looking at one component, one cell within a much larger living system, a system capable of solving problems, sharing information, making decisions, adapting to change, and surviving challenges that no individual bee could overcome alone. The deeper scientists investigate bee colonies, the more extraordinary they appear. But there is one final question we have not answered. What happens when this system begins to fail? What happens when the pollinators maintaining ecosystems start disappearing? Because over the past few decades, scientists around the world have been observing a troubling trend. Bee populations in many regions are under pressure. Colonies are struggling, and the consequences could extend far beyond the hive. To understand why, we must examine what happens when one of Earth's most important biological systems begins to break down. Imagine walking through an orchard in spring. The trees are alive with blossoms. Thousands of flowers cover every branch. At first glance, everything appears normal, healthy, vibrant, full of promise. But weeks later, something feels wrong. The flowers are gone, yet the fruit never arrives. The branches remain empty. The harvest never comes. Not because of drought, not because of disease, not because of a storm, but because one critical process never happened. Pollination. For millions of years, bees have been helping connect plants to their future. They move pollen, enable reproduction, support ecosystems, and maintain biological systems so ancient that they existed long before humans appeared, which raises a disturbing question. What happens if the bees begin to disappear? For scientists, this is no longer a hypothetical scenario. Over the past several decades, researchers across the world have documented worrying declines in many pollinator populations. In some regions, bee colonies have struggled under a combination of pressures: habitat loss, pesticides, parasites, diseases, climate change, agricultural intensification. Each problem alone is difficult. Together, they create challenges unlike anything bee populations have faced before. One of the most widely discussed phenomena emerged in the early 2000s. Beekeepers began reporting unusual losses. Colonies that appeared healthy would suddenly collapse. Worker bees would vanish, leaving behind queens, immature bees, and food supplies. The event became known as colony collapse disorder, and for a time, it captured global attention. Scientists searched for answers. But the deeper they investigated, the more complicated the picture became. No single cause explained every case. Instead, researchers discovered multiple overlapping stressors. Parasites weakened colonies. Pathogens spread disease. Chemical exposure created additional strain. Poor nutrition reduced resilience. Environmental changes disrupted established patterns. The result was not one enemy, but many. A convergence of pressures affecting bee health simultaneously. And while headlines often focused on honeybees, the broader concern extended far beyond a single species. Because the world contains more than 20,000 known bee species, most people never see them. Many are solitary. Some do not produce honey. Some live underground. Others nest in wood, stems, or hidden cavities. Yet together, they contribute to pollination across countless ecosystems, and many of them face challenges of their own. As natural habitats disappear, food sources become fragmented, wildflower diversity declines, nesting locations vanish, survival becomes increasingly difficult. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this. The disappearance of bees would not create a Hollywood-style apocalypse overnight. The world would not suddenly become lifeless. Nature is far more complex than that. Other pollinators exist: butterflies, moths, beetles, birds, bats, flies. Many species contribute to pollination. Ecosystems possess resilience. Life adapts. But adaptation has limits. And bees occupy an unusually important position within the network. Their efficiency, their numbers, their specialization, their evolutionary relationship with flowering plants, all make them exceptionally valuable. Without sufficient pollination, many plant populations would struggle. Reproduction rates would decline. Plant diversity could decrease. Food webs would experience stress. Wildlife dependent on specific plants could face challenges. The effects would ripple outward. Not always dramatically, but persistently, like removing thousands of tiny support beams from a vast structure. The building may not collapse immediately, but stability begins to erode. Human agriculture would also face serious consequences. Many crops benefit directly from pollination. Some depend heavily upon it. Reduced pollination often means reduced yields, lower productivity, greater costs, and increased pressure on food systems. In certain regions of the world, farmers have already experienced glimpses of this reality. In areas where natural pollinators became scarce, human workers were forced to pollinate flowers by hand. A slow, labor-intensive, and expensive process. One that highlights just how valuable pollinators truly are. Because for millions of years, bees have been providing services no machine can fully replicate. No technology can replace entire ecosystems. No invention can perfectly imitate evolutionary partnerships refined over 100 million years. And this is where the story becomes larger than bees themselves. Because ultimately, this documentary was never just about insects. It was about systems. Hidden systems, the invisible processes operating beneath everyday life. Most people notice the final product, the fruit, the flower, the honey, the harvest. But rarely do we notice the network supporting those outcomes. The countless interactions occurring beyond human attention. The ancient biological relationships holding ecosystems together. And bees are one of the clearest examples. A tiny creature, barely noticed by most people, yet connected to forests, fields, food chains, agriculture, wild ecosystems, and the reproduction of countless plant species. For thousands of years, humans looked at bees and saw honey, a sweet reward, a useful product, a simple explanation. But honey was never the real story. Honey was merely the visible clue, the surface layer, the cover story. The deeper truth was always hidden in plain sight. Inside flower fields, inside forests, inside orchards, inside ecosystems stretching across the entire planet. The true function of bees was never to feed humans. It was to help maintain one of Earth's most important biological networks, a network that has operated continuously for more than 100 million years, long before the rise of civilization, long before histories, long before history itself. And perhaps that is the most humbling lesson of all, because while humans often view themselves as the architects of the modern world, many of the systems we depend upon were built long before we arrived, created not by engineers, not by governments, not by technology, but by evolution, patiently refining solutions across unimaginable spans of time. And among its greatest creations is a tiny insect carrying pollen from one flower to another, A creature so familiar that most people never stop to wonder why it exists. Yet without it, the world would be a very different place. Honey was never the story. The story was always the system. And for more than 100 million years, that system has quietly helped life on Earth survive. The next time you see a bee, you won't just be looking at an insect. You'll be looking at one of the most important workers in the history of our planet.